You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good, and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan, author, speaker, and a Muslim woman who spent her life wrestling with a messy, miraculous collision of faith and real life. And kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Welcome back to our Islamophobia Playbook series, episode number 2, which dives into how white Christian nationalist groups have made Islamophobia their pathway to mainstreaming anti-Muslim bias in America. By weaponizing tropes like Muslims are invading America to replace white Christians into a political movement, they threaten everything I have worked for. This isn't just about policy or politics. By positioning themselves as defenders of Christianity against Islam, they're perverting both faiths, and especially the teachings of Jesus, who preached love thy neighbor, not hate each other. But here's what really gets me. Right-wing politicians now are using white nationalist hate rhetoric against Muslims, and they face zero consequences for it. What they say in forums gets repeated in Congress. Today, I've invited a very special guest with deep expertise on the topic. He will help us understand who white Christian nationalists really are and how they convince millions of Americans that defending Christianity requires attacking Islam. We're also going to discuss what we can do about it, because frankly, I know I refuse to let my faith be a weapon in somebody else's war. So let's begin. My guest today is Todd Green. He is a professor of religious studies for over 14 years at Lutheran College. He's an advocate of interfaith bridge building, author of many books. He's a frequent media commentator, has appeared on multiple channels like CNN, NPR, Washington Post. So I now welcome Todd Green to my show. Welcome, Todd.
Thanks, Daisy, for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
You and I have known each other for so many years. And I know the work that you do and I do, we've seen kind of similar patterns and traits, kind of the victim complex, rewriting history, dehumanizing language across extremist groups. Can you explain from your perspective what you see that stands out as a pattern?
I think for extremist groups, irrespective of racial, religious, or political identities or orientations, what they all tend to do and share in common is they labor really hard to maintain some sort of us versus them framework. And they see themselves obviously as the us, the end group, that the ones that need to be protected and needs to be defended against the them, whoever the them is.
Right.
One could argue that this, I think, has deeper psychological roots. I think human beings are prone to categorize themselves and others into in groups and out groups. And I think when you add to this the psychological tendency for the human brain to want to simplify complexity, including the complexity of the diverse array of human beings and their experiences, and to do this by taking shortcuts through the use of stereotypes, that's what you start to see across extremist groups.
Yeah.
There's something actually very human about it, even though that doesn't make it moral, but it certainly, there's a psychological underpinning to it all.
Yeah, sort of like tribalism, right? Like
Yes.
retreating into your tribe and trying to protect your own tribe from the threat of the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's universal. It's not new to the 21st century either.
Yeah, it's almost like part of the DNA of survival instinct. In your opinion, what is white Christian nationalism and what are they trying to achieve? Like, what is the threat to them?
So I would say white Christian nationalism is an ideology, and one could even argue a movement of sorts, that asserts, in the case of the United States, that this is a country that was founded by Christians, and it was a country developed to reflect the ideals, values, and worldviews of Christians in general and white Protestant Christians in particular, at least going back to just prior to the founding of the nation. It has been, and I think it continues to be deployed to define American identity over against perceived threats from people who are not white, who are immigrants, or who belong to other religions. But what's most important, I think, to understand for the purposes of our conversation today is that American identity in the context of white Christian nationalism is defined either explicitly or implicitly in relation to race and religion. So there's, in some sense, there's a purifying sort of endeavor involved amongst many white Christian nationalists when it comes to who we are as Americans, what it means to be American, how we define American identity, how we do that over against some, again, outgroup or perceived other, right? And this notion that that outgroup based upon race or religion is somehow an existential threat to what it means to be American or to the nation as a whole. So they're trying to, in many ways, defend the nation and save it from this existential threat.
But I don't understand, I mean, I'm an immigrant to this country, and I always thought that this country was, founded on the backs of immigrants, the waves of immigration that has, over time assimilated and become part of what we used to call the melting pot. We have these incredible preambles, right? Everybody being equal in the eyes of the government. How do you portray non-whites as being outsiders when it is part of our Constitution that we're all equal?
That's the tension of American history, right? It's this push and pull between wanting to define an in-group in the ways that white Christian nationalists do over against an out-group that's not perceived to be the group that the Constitution applies to, right? That they're not Americans. So, the we the people language doesn't apply to 19th century Eastern European Jewish immigrants, for example, back in the day. Or whoever that group is perceived to be. But then you have this sort of vision of the founders, right? They were also reaching beyond themselves, aspiring for something greater, which is also very much a part of American history. And
Yeah. So, I mean, this notion that, the white nationalists sort of positioning themselves as defenders of Christianity, specifically against Islam. I mean, how is Christianity under threat in a nation which is majority Christian? Can you explain that?
there is a longer history to this. I mean, in many ways, the historical roots of Islamophobia are not modern. They go back to the Middle Ages when Islamic empires rose up and became political threats to European Christian kingdoms and empires. And so there's this great political rivalry going back to the Middle Ages, where
Yeah.
European Christian kingdoms and empires did see Islam as a threat. Some of that was theological, this recognition that Islam was a monotheistic religion, but it had a false prophet, right? It misunderstood the true teachings of Christianity or distorted them in some ways. So there was that theological, sort of toolkit that was being used to other Muslims in the same way that was happening with Jews as well. And then you had the political threat, right, which was Islamic empires actually were formidable political rivals. I mean, you think about the Ottoman Empire, for example. European Christian kingdoms were quite anxious and concerned about the potential threat of the Ottoman Empire as a political threat. We've inherited these stereotypes, these anxieties, these fears about this perceived threat, and with Islam and presumed Islamic empires that goes back many years. So the theological and the political threats combined, I think, are there. But what has changed, is in the 19th and 20th century is the rise of modern nationalism. You saw the decline, at least in political power, of Islamic empires and the ascendancy in many ways of the power of European Christian kingdoms and empires. So the fortunes were changed, but the political rivalry was still there all the way through the mid-20th century. And then with the fall of the Cold War, we have the Cold Clash of Civilizations framework that emerges, and this idea that Islamic civilization, broadly construed, is the lingering significant threat for the West, if you will.
Yeah, and so then when we heard Samuel Huntington coin that expression after 9/11, Clash of Civilizations, and he wrote a book on it. So that's not something new. You're saying that that goes back to like medieval times when there was this perceived clash in the minds of Christians.
So Huntington's thesis in some ways is building upon historic tropes and anxieties, even if it's got a modern twist to it, because he's trying to predict the future in terms of what is going to emerge in with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. What his main prediction was that it'll be the tension between Islam and the West, right? And Islamic civilizations would be clashing with Western civilizations, and in a way that would lead to violence. And I would not call Huntington himself a white Christian nationalist. I don't think he was motivated by that in any sense, but nonetheless, that kind of thinking is still very much implicit in the larger narrative upon which white Christian nationalism is built.
Yeah. So, for instance, right now Muslims are only 3% of the population. Well, yeah, but yet they perceive us to be a threat.
And an outsider, right? Even though
Exactly.
so Muslims are not new to the
Yeah.
United States; they've been part of the fabric, and and certainly part of this, the emergence and the growth and success of this nation. And similar with Europe, right? Muslims are not brand new to Europe either. So this idea that there's an Islamic civilization and a Western civilization as a dichotomy itself is extremely problematic. And again, it operates under certain assumptions about Christian identity and European identity, or Christian identity and American identity, without recognizing that there was already diversity built into the colonial America and all the way into the early the founding of the nation, that that oftentimes gets lost in these narratives. So we've got certainly have to push back on this notion that Muslims are somehow new and therefore are foreign to the American experiment, if you will. In fact, they've been a huge part of it since the beginning.
So now I'd like to go a little bit deeper into the white nationalist messaging and the tropes of Islamophobia that they bring up. So from your perspective, how do they distort Islamic teachings to justify their hatred? In other words, we've often heard Muslims are terrorists, and this is a trope. How do they advance that trope to further their agenda?
Yeah, there's the how and there's the why, right? And I
Right.
think they're connected, particularly for those who are very overtly pushing white Christian nationalist narratives, not sort of implicitly in terms of an implicit bias, but what you and I would recognize as the Islamophobia industry.
Right.
People who make a living off this, who do what you're doing right now, but on the other end of the spectrum.
The
And
opposite. The
very
opposite.
opposite, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
not promote bridge building, but to promote harmful stereotypes and this targeting of Muslims. Many of those tropes themselves say less objectively about Muslims and Islam and more about ongoing anxieties and the white Christian nationalist populations, or the people who are pushing these narratives themselves. So this notion, for example, that Islam is prone to violence, it's inherently violent. I mean, that's an old trope. It's been around for a long time, and some of that's born out of the Middle Ages as well in terms of this political rivalry.
Yeah.
But it's also not rooted in the modern sense in anything that's really objective. There's perceptions, of course, and there's the realities and occasion of extremist groups engaging in violence. But the full complexity and diversity of Muslim communities and populations and ideologies, it often gets lost in all that. There's no nuance with it. And so this idea then is just that Islam is violent. And if Islam is violent, then Daisy, you're violent. And you don't even have to show me that you're violent. I just know because I've already got the formula. These folks
Right.
have given it to me. So that there's the shortcut, right? There's no need to actually think or like, well, I've known Daisy for a long time. She doesn't have a violent bone in her body, but I can't trust what I'm actually seeing with her because she's a Muslim. Therefore, I trust the trope. And that's usually what extremist groups want you to do, white Christian nationalists. They deploy that in the 19th century against Catholics and against Jews. We see that in the most horrific sense in the early to mid 20th century in Nazi Germany, right? And this idea that this is a group that's problematic, that they're a fifth column, they're a Trojan horse, sort of ready to come in and infiltrate the country and take it over. They're not democratic. All that sort of stuff. Some of these tropes Muslims have encountered, but so have Catholics and Jews in American history as well. Even this idea that Muslims are foreign, that white Christian nationalists are so prone to using, that was deployed against Catholics readily in the 19th century and much of the 20th century. John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president, had to wrestle and navigate this idea that if he were elected president, he might give allegiance to a foreign entity, the Vatican.
Yeah.
So some of these are actually not particular to Muslims either, but that they are part of a larger white Christian nationalist framework and ideology that then gets deployed by the group right now that is perceived to be either as the greatest threat, or that there seems to be an opportunity to target this group to gain larger political or economic leverage.
Yeah, so I think this fear-mongering has a history to it. Right now, Muslims being the newcomers, that the latest newcomers, especially the immigrant ones, we're facing the same thing too. So this is an issue of, fear of accepting the newcomer.
It is. It comes out in certain more explicit ways among, say, white Christian nationalists who really lean into that and name that very particularly. But I would say implicitly, this notion that Muslims don't quite belong, or we've got to be at least a little bit suspicious of their belonging as Americans, exists on the left end of the political spectrum as well. Liberal Islamophobia is a real thing. And it's a conversation that we probably haven't had enough of for those of us who have been trying to study and counter Islamophobia in the United States. You may remember when President Clinton, Bill Clinton, at the Democratic National Convention in 2016, trying to push back, I believe, on then candidate Trump's proposed Muslim ban, uh, has this part in the speech where he says, if you're Muslim and you love freedom and you hate terror, then stay here and help us fight this. The way that whole sentence was written by the speech maker and then delivered by President Clinton himself is all about this implicit othering and casting Muslims as foreign and maybe not quite belonging.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the Islamophobia of the left and the right. This reminds me of the weaponization of the oppressed Muslim woman, which is such a deeply held stereotype that the right uses against us and the left uses against us. It's a stated foreign policy objective to free Muslim women from the clutches of,
Yeah.
these misogynistic Muslim men. So yeah, you're right, and that's what the feminists also use against us.
Yeah, and have used that sometimes in pursuing or promoting military endeavors and things along those lines, which usually have a horrific impact on women. And and just things that people don't really know about it. Sometimes preying on the lack of knowledge that many people might have. An example simply is that there are a number of countries where Muslim women have either been presidents or prime ministers, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's not a tiny list.
Yeah.
We still have yet to have had a Muslim as president of the United States.
Be
That too,
careful what you say.
that too. Yeah, a woman as president of the United States, irrespective of religious background, right?
Yeah.
And I would say that's part of how Islamophobia functions. In other parts of the world, Muslim women have struggled for equal rights.
Mm.
And that same dynamic exists in the United States as well. It's not like this is a country where the liberation of women is just a given. There are glass ceilings that still exist, and it's not a coincidence that we've had all these presidents up to 47, and yet have not had a woman become president. That should trigger an internal conversation here in the United States that oftentimes gets ignored because it's projected onto Muslims.
Yeah.
Misogyny is a Muslim problem. It's not a universal problem. It's
Yeah.
not an American problem in the same way, but it's a Muslim problem. So as long as it's their problem, they are the uncivilized group. We can target that, and we don't have to wrestle with the more difficult truths that exist here in the United States. And that's how a lot of Islamophobia functions.
Yeah. So, Todd, I know that you're a person of faith, and like myself, you also trying to always de-link the weaponization of religion. How do they weaponize Christianity?
It's interesting when you look at this historically with Christians who have promoted some sort of anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim, ideology, the way they use the Bible. What's tricky is that, references to Jews or their ancestors are very prominent in Christian scriptures, right?
Yeah.
In the New Testament, there's certainly the ideas being debated of Christians as the new Israel, right? They have superseded. They have brought to a fulfillment the promises made of old of Abraham, but these are now this sort of, in some ways, the new chosen people, and the church is the culmination of a larger plan, but replacing Jews. Muslims, obviously, as a historical entity, don't come on the scene until much later after the Christian scriptures have been written. And so you have to take a lot of supersession sort of language from the Bible, I think, and then retroactively apply it to Muslims to still have that sort of exclusive theology that says, again, here we have a false prophet. Maybe they look to the Old Testament and examples of false prophets, and now the Prophet Muhammad is another one of those false
Mhm.
prophets. Things along those lines that this is not the real chosen people. This is not God's people. They are distorting the truth of Jesus and that sort of thing. So there's definitely a lot of that, Daisy. I think historically, frankly, in modern Christian theology, in my experience of interacting with white Christian nationalists, they're often that literate in biblical text. I have actually found quite the opposite. The knowledge of the Bible and the scriptural text is just pretty weak, and as a result, they don't have much of a grounding one way or the other to look to the Bible as a resource for combating hate and discrimination and bigotry, much less to promote it. But I don't encounter a lot of people doing deep digs into the Bible in order to justify this. If anything, it's a pretty shallow theology that's behind it all.
Yeah, I think the anxiety is the numbers anxiety. I remember
Yeah.
Karen Armstrong saying many years ago that when she used to go to church, there'd be like, one little old lady and a cat. And then she'll go to a mosque and it's full of people, right? It's everybody has come to pray and they pray 5 times a day. And I think that's the anxiety, is that Muslims are still practicing and they are committed to their faith. They've not abandoned any of their, core religious practices, and even though they're living in Western countries, they're still committed, right? By and large, and I think that's the anxiety, is that so many of them see themselves, and I've done a little study on them, that they are actually saviors of Christian, Western Christian civilization, because Europe has pretty much abandoned it.
Yeah, I think Europe's a good example of how you have significant secularization. If you go to a lot of historic state churches in Europe, you see a lot of empty pews, right? These are not vibrant institutions like they once were. The religious community that's most vibrant, most visible now are Muslim communities. And so where there's been this sort of vacuum of religious presence with Christians as they've retreated in many ways, or the church as institutions have declined, the insertion of religion into public spaces has really come prominently from Muslims, and that's created some of this anxiety. And then in the United States, that plays out a little bit differently. Compared to Europe, has not had that same kind of decline, even if certain segments of it maybe have been losing members. But there is still that anxiety about numbers, I think, even though the numbers, as you mentioned earlier, are not that large. Same with Jews, right? Jews and Muslims make up a very small percentage of the US population, but the
Yeah.
perception is there. In fact, in my experience, many Americans uh, tend to overestimate the percentage of the population that's Muslim, because it represents a greater place in their mind from how they've engaged with the media than it's actually the case in reality. And in that sense, also, it mirrors earlier historical developments. There was a lot of anxiety in the late 19th and early 20th century in America with Catholic immigrants.
Yeah.
And this worry that Catholics would sort of be flooding the country and then poisoning it in many ways. And Catholics, I should add, were also racialized in many cases. The Irish coming into America in the 19th century oftentimes were perceived as not being fully white. I used to teach this stuff, Daisy, to my students who were like, what? The Irish were not white?
Yeah, I remember during the Ground Zero controversy, you were very involved with seeing that unfold. I remember that at a landmark meeting, a priest came over to me and he said there was a time when St. Peter's Church, right here in this neighborhood, had to put a fence around it because they were going to burn it down.
Hmm.
And that St. Peter's Church is standing there. It's an icon. And then a rabbi said to me that it took an act of Congress to build a synagogue in Washington. So this notion of invasion narrative has fueled this nationalist ideology before us.
Yeah, it's got pretty deep roots, right? The core anxieties are not particularly new, and this project of building, maintaining, sustaining a white Christian nation
Right.
over against whatever perceived outgroup there is has been longstanding, and to some extent, a lot of Americans have inherited those prejudices and tropes, and Muslims are having to contend with that right now. And certainly in the post 9/11 era, that's been a very tough battle. And that the evolution of that story continues, but still very interesting to see how Muslims are navigating the political and cultural spaces of the United States at a time when I think there's been a resurgence of Islamophobia.
Yeah, I know at least 20 women that have decided that they want to serve, they want to lead, and they've all won, in all kinds of races they've won. So that's the good news, is that Muslims are not hiding. They want to serve their nation. They want to be represented, and but also, stand up for what they believe are core American values. So if we talk about the kind of this artificial demographic fear that stokes the anti-Muslim sentiment, why has this anti-Muslim sentiment become so acceptable in political discourse and in mainstream circles?
In the post 9/11 era, there was an initial coming together across the political aisle of agreement, harmony, if you will, on some policies that really were targeting Muslims for the sake of defending the nation and maintaining a strong national security defense. But in the aftermath of 9/11, what Muslims became was similar to what Japanese Americans in World War II became when they
Mm,
were put in internment camps.
yeah,
Japanese Americans were put in internment camps not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. And that was
right.
behind Roosevelt's executive order. They were symbolic stand-ins of the real threat or perceived threat abroad in the Japanese Empire, and that's what Muslims became after 9/11, symbolic stand-ins. They're being targeted not because of what they have done, but because of who they are.
Yeah.
Now, there's another word for that. It's bigotry, right? I mean, that's textbook bigotry.
Mm.
You just,
Well, it's also unfair, right? You don't blame
yeah.
an entire group for the actions of a few, right? Isn't that un-American? Like,
Totally un-American. Yeah, exactly. Because it's a presumption of guilt, right?
right.
Again, just to take you, my friend here, Daisy is guilty not because of anything she has done, but because she calls herself a Muslim. And I remember some guy named Osama bin Laden called himself a Muslim too, and he did some really, really, really horrible, horrific things. Therefore, Daisy's probably guilty unless
Yeah.
she can prove to me otherwise. The challenge, of course, that in the post 9/11 era is that you probably can't. Probably still going to be suspicious of you no matter what you do. That's the insidious nature of Islamophobia. So I would argue that a lot of Islamophobia in post 9/11 America has resonated across the political spectrum and has taken hold because it's been tied up with U.S. foreign policy.
I
Yeah.
remember every time I used to go on television, the first thing that they would do is ask if I had condemned the
Yeah.
act or if I had condemned this group. That was almost like a starter, you know? Like you couldn't even get started with anything else.
You mentioned double standard, right? I mean, think
Yeah.
about when Dylan Roof went into that Charleston African American church and opened fire in horrific murders, right? Very, very much racially driven. And I was interviewed and have been interviewed off and on about Islamophobia for years and Islam and violence. No one ever, ever asked me to condemn Dylan Roof.
Yeah.
Why? Probably just because they assumed that he and I had nothing to do with each other. I was presumed innocent unless I were to say something or have done something that would otherwise make you think that I would have something to do with Dylan Roof. Had he been a Muslim, that would not have been the case for you, right?
Right.
That's what part of what Islamophobia is. It's a sort of this racialization, this sort of collectively thinking of Muslims together as one entity against whom you can sort of project all sorts of stereotypes. And then the burden is on Muslims to try to prove that they're not that. But the problem is you got on air and you defended, and you made your statements and you still kept getting asked that. It doesn't matter how many times you condemn terrorism until you're blue in the face. That presumption is still there in a way that I'm given the benefit of the doubt. I'm not treated in that same way, but you're not. And
Yeah.
that's what Islamophobia does.
Yeah. Well, Todd, I could talk to you endlessly about this topic, but we don't have hours and hours, but what do you think would work best at this point? Is there a counter narrative that we have to work against this Islamophobic messaging that's coming not only from white nationalists, but also from politicians, which is frankly very, very dangerous because they're saying all kinds of things without any consequence?
Right. Well, some of this is a tall order, and some of it's maybe more realizable in the short term. But the tall order, I think, is changing U.S. foreign policy, rethinking it a bit in a way that's just more even-handed when it comes to Muslim populations, and not thought of primarily through a militaristic lens. And you start seeing them as human beings and treating them and responding to them that way. But in the short run, we certainly know that building of relationships across religious differences matters. It's a game changer, and we need a lot more of that. Interfaith work still has a lot, and we need to find ways in terms of creating more spaces for humanizing stories. And I do think with more prominent politicians who have a Muslim identity being elected, combined with what I think probably could happen in time, which is Muslims as they do grow very slowly as a percentage of the population, building institutions that serve American life in the same way that Catholics did. Catholics built orphanages, they created universities. So in some ways, it's Muslims keep doing what they're doing in terms of building these institutions, being entrepreneurs, running for political office, continuing to serve the larger public as doctors, as lawyers, as teachers, as retail store owners. And I think in time we will see some of this change. But without the foreign policy changes, I don't think we'll see macro changes.
Yeah. I agree with you wholeheartedly because I think that we have to work on the foreign policy issue because every time we have footprints in Muslim countries, that gets reported in the press here, and oftentimes those images are not balanced; they're negative, and that then gets somehow portrayed on poor Muslims living in America. So this has to be, or they have to engage with the diaspora differently. They have to distinguish the diaspora from the extremist groups that America's engaged with. And that is our responsibility as Muslims, right? And that's the work that we've been doing, and that's why I had you here today. But I have another question for you as a closing question, because I know that you're Senior Director of Campus Partnerships at Interfaith America. What are you doing specifically now in campuses to improve the situation there? Because, many of these tropes have landed in campuses and is affecting, Muslim students. Some professors have been fired. Some students are, their freedom of speech and assembly is being restricted. Can you tell us what's happening in campuses?
I can. I mean, I can give you my personal take. I don't want to speak officially on behalf of the organization, but I think a lot of what we've seen in the past almost 2 years now on campuses is sort of a collapsing of an infrastructure that where people can't be brought together across some significant differences. One could argue, and that some of what's been missing has been pluralism, right? That there's a lack of a pluralistic infrastructure where you do create space and opportunity intentionally to bring people of different religious, political, and other ideologies and identities across difference to collaborate on some larger common good. We were struggling to see that in the post-October 7th, 2023 climate. We were seeing really another push of pitting Jews and Muslims against each other and pitting
Yeah.
anti-Semitism and Islamophobia against each other. And at least as a scholar of Islamophobia, I would argue that that's a big part of the problem right now is both on college campuses, but in the country as a whole, is that politically Jews and Muslims are pitted against each other. And sometimes the people pitting them against each other are neither Jewish nor Muslim, all right? And they have other agendas. I would argue probably implicit assumption that's in the media and across the political spectrum that these are just two communities bound to be in conflict. And then we see that play out on campus. The most important thing I would say, maybe this is the most important thing I'll say on this podcast is you don't solve one form of prejudice by invoking another. The solution to rising anti-Semitism is not Islamophobia, any more than the solution to rising Islamophobia is invoking anti-Semitic tropes. These two prejudices have some overlap. They have some commonalities. They have both been formed in modern history by racism and nationalism, but we can't use one prejudice to solve the other. But that is oftentimes, even if implicitly, being done in American politics and in the media. And that's where I think we have to push back and call attention to that much more, because neither Jews nor Muslims will be helped by that in the long run.
Yeah, because the common enemy for Jews and Muslims is also white nationalist supremacy.
Absolutely.
Because they consider Jews to be their number one enemy, Muslims to be their number two enemy, immigrants three, Black Americans four. That's just like the pecking. So we're all part of the out group, and we're not part of the in group. So we have an opportunity here to ally with one another and to fight against the bigger issues. So I really want to thank you very much for joining me today and for providing these wonderful words of wisdom that you've given us. And so, listeners, I hope that let's all set a new tone for creating a wider understanding of our commonalities as Americans and humans, regardless of race, religion, or culture. Please share this podcast with your friends to show them the nuances of these extremist mindsets and the danger that they pose to our broader society. Until next time, I'm Daisy Khan with Wise Women. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you, and definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter, and your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. so let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.